Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are. I am Dr. Michael Connor, the proud CEO and founder of the Agile Evolutionary Group and the host for Voices for Excellence. And yes, we are in season 2, and this is an absolute treat to have Anthony Kim here on Voices for Excellence. Anthony Kim, before the episode had started, I was just admiring Anthony Kim's work. Anthony is one of, I like to say, the organizational design czars across our country. So when we talk about organizational theory, developing systems, designing systems, especially concretizing systems for equity and innovation, there is no other person in this country than Anthony Kim. Yes, I reference all of his theory, all of the concepts that he has devised, whether it be from his first book, The Personalized Playbook, or even a book that is absolute one of my favorite, The New School Rules. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Anthony Kim on VFE. Anthony, my brother, good to see you. Now, I know you travel, whether it be you're staying in San Diego for the summer. You live in Las Vegas. I mean, I don't know where you're at, but it's good to see you.
Great seeing you. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to have this conversation. And I know from just reading the preview of the questions, you're going to go deep. So thanks for inviting me to this, because I already learned a lot just reading your questions.
Oh, man. No, thank you, Anthony. I'm going to stop it right there. That's a compliment coming from you, right? That's all I need, right? I just need my marketing tool. I just need my sentence coming from you, and then we'll end it. No. And that is such an honor because, again, my work personally, when, I'm a systems thinker, think about systems in the context of broad transformation, even down to its granular level of how these systems or subsystems are operationalized within an organization. And Anthony, whether it be your blogs or whether it be your white papers or whether it be your books, especially the New School Rules, just that is just a great referencing tool. And thank you for everything that you have done holistically for education. But now let's get into the fun question first before we actually go in depth and where I unwrap the anatomy of your brain with regards to organizational design, but now adding that element of innovation to it. But before we get that deep into the episode, right, Anthony, when leaders, education stakeholders, national organizations that, invite you to be a keynote speaker or even just meet with a collection of leaders or even teachers that you work with throughout the country, when they first encounter you or first encounter with Anthony Kim, what song would they say defines your equity and innovation stance in education? Can't wait to hear this.
Oh man, this honestly was a tough one, and I actually spent some time thinking about different songs that come to mind, and I think unfortunately it's not one that's like super positive. It's kind of a sad song, and the song is "Drift Away" by Dobie Gray.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I picked that is because the first line of the song starts, day after day, I'm more confused. Yet I look for the light through the pouring rain.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I'm always looking for that light where there's hope, and we're trying to make some of that change. And the third line says, that's a game that I hate to lose.
Right.
And then it goes through the lyrics, and then it also says, the world seems so unkind. And there's, especially now and as we go into elections and just the polarity that we experience in the country, it's hard to navigate these things without when it just requires some discussion and conversation and building relationships. And so that unfortunately, that's the song that comes to mind right now in the state that we're in today.
Yeah. Yeah. And Anthony, when I think about that, right, drift away, and just the first line, right, day after day, I am more confused. And when you think about where we're at in education, right, I'm reading a book, Thriving in Disruption, right, and they talk about this exploited version of VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, where they call it unweis, uncertain, volatile, intersectionality, complex, and exponential. Because day after day, the education model, the operating model to try to create this new value capture, value creation, it makes us even more confused because you have this polarization of multiple variables that are playing into the factor of how we design for equity and excellence. But I think it's grounded in what you said, discussions and building relationships. I think we lost that and to a certain degree in education, but drift away. There's nothing sad about that. There's a lot of connectivity within that song as well. But when we talk about discussion and building relationships, right? I want to get into the second question. We all know, Anthony, you're a best-selling author, a renowned blogger, and you've been featured in many national publications, but I really want to specifically focus on your two books. And the reason why I want to focus on your two books, this is subjective. I love them, man. I love them, brother. I love them. So I'm being subjective and highlighting because I want my audience or my listeners to really get the full or the totality of the macro themes from the personalized playbook, and one of my all-time favorites, Anthony, and I'm not just saying it just to be saying it, it is really one of my all-time favorites, the New School Rules, right? Just providing a brief overview. What are the critical themes from your books? But more importantly, if I'm a leader or if I'm a teacher, which strategies or resonating lessons can I take from each of your books?
Yeah. Thanks for those kind words. I really appreciate that. And I'm grateful that someone like you who's really, been studying a lot of different types of books and different ways speak so highly of this content. So thank you so much. Starting with the personalized learning playbook, I wrote that 10 years ago. And at the time, it was right when districts were just implementing iPads and this and that. And we just felt like this idea of what the technology should do should be different. And I think one way to think about it is I think about learning in kind of three axes. The first axis is the x-axis, and that's the acceleration of learning. How fast are you going from kind of below, at, or above grade level is one way to look at that axis, right? Just how well do you know that content, right? And then the y-axis is around depth of learning. And so the depth of learning goes from just using Bloom's taxonomy. You could use other taxonomies, but using Bloom's, it goes from kind of the bottom, which is remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. And then the z-axis is really, do I go from kind of dependent to interested to involved to self-directed? And as you think about kind of the future workforce, the future citizen, the person that you're trying to develop through school systems, you want what I call the big box of learning, where everybody is self-directed. They're above grade level or above whatever benchmark it is, and they're able to create. And a lot of times the things that we think about are in the small box of learning, which is within the smaller part of that axis, which is remembering, totally dependent and focused on below grade level. And so I think when I think about personalized learning is how do I create the path from somebody that's at the small box to build out their big box of learning? And that's what personalized learning is. How do I fill that gap for somebody? Yeah. So that's really the premise of the personalized learning playbook. And if I had to give one message, is that if the teachers are excited to teach, the students will get excited too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Anthony, if I could interject before you go into the New School Rules, because I really want to highlight this for my audience. The personalized learning playbook, Anthony wrote that 10 years ago. This was right in the middle. I would say right at the middle of the BC stage of education, before COVID, before we started talking about technology. Before we started talking about generative models being integrated into education, Anthony was a unicorn thinking about this. When you look at the three axes, right? The x-axis is the acceleration of learning, the y-axis, the depth of knowledge, knowledge taxonomies, and the z-axis, which we know as heterogogy, self-directed learning, and moving that small box of learning, rote memorization of skills, articulation of knowledge through standards, through a summative assessment, to this big box of learning, creation, and having that ability to have this internal self-directed learning. This is a sub-variant question, Anthony. I have my audience use this as a professional learning mechanism, asynchronous self-directed learning, going back and forth, right? But Anthony, if you can go deep into this, right, this self-directed learning, because now and I think the education space, and this is just a very broad theory, is starting to really accept this entry point of technology and AI into the operating model. You were talking about this 10 years ago, right? What does that look like in context, specifically around if I want to design my organization or redesign my organization, where that self-directed learning is the grounded impetus for the learning experience for students?
Yeah, that's a tough one. One, it has to do with just the habits of behaviors. How do we build those habits and behaviors in people? For example, like we all know that training and exercise is good, right? Especially as you get older, like lifting weights is great for bone density.
Right.
Not everybody does that, right? Like, and so there's behaviors that you have to build and systems that you have to build around that to support it. And you also have to have friends that push you and collaborate with you to do that, having that community basis, right? Because if I'm just trying to do it by myself, then it's quite hard. But the fact that you and I have a connection and we're able to have discussion about these things makes it super exciting for us to do that. And even in preparation for this, I read a bunch of things. I had to flip through the personalized learning playbook again because I knew you were going to ask me questions about it. And now I'm excited to have that conversation. And that's what energizes me, right? The fact that we're having that human connection around this topic.
Absolutely. And Anthony, I'll tell you this, building systems of what you just highlighted and articulated, it automatically brought me back to this inward-outward design, i.e. divergent design of an organization versus an outward-in, i.e. convergent design, which a lot of the bureaucratic systems that we see in education are operationalized, which in conclusion, thus creates the industrial or Jeffersonian model. So getting into one of my favorite books, right? And I wanted to part and parcel it intentionally. Please elaborate on the New School Rules. And please, and if to my audience, if you don't have it, I highly recommend it. Go get it. It's still relevant. Go ahead, Anthony. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I could tie it in a little bit with personalized learning and AI a bit. So just kind of going back to that access point, right? And you mentioned AI. I think, everybody's talking about right now. And the reason the conversations are a little bit flawed is because the talk around AI is really around that small box of learning, right? Remembering and understanding the low grade level and it completely dependent on a teacher. But if you use AI at the big box of learning, creating, right, you're self-directed, you're thinking above the basic understanding, then you're using AI as a tool that accelerates your ability to innovate and create.
Absolutely.
Right. And so why do I mention that? Well, because in New School Rules, we talk about why we've tried to implement things so many times and have failed over and over again. And a lot of it has to do with the way we're organized and the way we work with each other as adults and the school systems that we support.
Absolutely.
So I talk about 6 practices that are essential. And, these practices are a compilation of books that I've read, research that I've done, observations I've made visiting schools. And the first is plan for change, not perfection, right? We spend so much time just planning and we don't implement game theory to think about what the other people are going to be doing. We just like, this is the plan. And we just assume everyone's going to adopt that plan without thinking about game theory.
Absolutely.
So that's one. Teams is like, how do you operate in teams? And really, it's just this idea that teams come and go, right? And I referenced the Hollywood style of management where, the producers come up with a movie idea, they bring in the casting director and the location managers. But once the location manager is done finding a location, they don't sit through the rest of the meetings that
Right.
go into editing, right? They get their work done, they bring their expertise, and they leave. And
Absolutely.
so teams come and go is really about how do we build more capacity within school systems, because oftentimes we're stuck in meetings where we're not contributing. And I could be doing something more productive by not being in that meeting. And if the leadership doesn't really think about the way teams come and go, it's really hard. Managing roles, this is another one. And this relates to equity, right? It's like, how do we give people that don't have positions of power opportunities and voice within some of the decision making that happens within an organization? So
Yeah.
it's really being clear about what the roles are, not focusing on the titles.
Right. Right.
Right? Where can I get, you always talk about diverse thinking, like where can I get that diverse thinking when I'm always relying on the same people around me to give me the actions and the next steps? So that's another. And then decision making, like how do we make decisions? And I think it's human nature to kind of lean towards saying no, or that it can't be done. And so a lot of times you're sitting in a meeting and you have this great idea, and there are 10 people that will say, well, we tried this, or that doesn't work, or have you thought? And so it just becomes a way not to try and learn from failure, right? Like learning from doing some of the things and trying and understanding. And so, because there are a lot of hypothetical reasons why something can't be done. And then sharing information. This is a tricky one because everybody, including some boards and community members, demand transparency. But if you get transparency, that means that not all the information is perfect, and it's subject to change,
Correct.
right? And because once you release information at that rate, it's constantly changing. And so people have to understand it better. And then the last piece I would say is, how do we create learning organizations? Schools should definitively be a learning organization, but they're not designed to be. And, that really just comes from Peter Senge's work and the fifth discipline, right? Like, how do you create an organization that learns? And kind of all our goal as education leaders and influencers in education should be trying to create schools that are learning organizations, not schools.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Anthony, I loved how you at the end tied in Peter Senge's work, because in order to get to that level of organizational culture, i.e., creating a learning culture, that creative tension, right? Your current state and your desired outcome, that's going to create that organizational chasm I always talk about. But your second point, right? And I think that this is essential for organizational coherence, is building social capital, or building that shared mental model around the goals. And that game theory is so, so, so important. And the six practices, wow, Anthony, I still reference them, right? Because they're so necessary for the AC stage of education. And going right into the next question, this is a great segue to underscore the six practices, right? We know the AC stage of education after COVID has presented a level of uncertainty and also a level of novelty within the ecosystem. But there are obviously equity and excellence quandaries or gaps that we are seeing. And as you stated before, this leads to this question or this foci around innovation and creativity to develop. And when I say develop and redesign organizations to focus on being a learning organization, an operating model where everybody's learning simultaneously. But I know that this is going to be an abstract question, Anthony. I apologize. But what are the systemic challenges you're seeing across the country? And what are some leadership approaches that can be lamented in the education model to curtail these current quandaries, i.e., equity and excellence gaps, at a macro level to ensure that we're closing them at the granular or micro level within a learning organization?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It took me a while just to like kind of sit on this one, and I appreciate you asking some of the challenging questions here. Um, I think first, just to set the stage for this, right? If you asked a Silicon Valley CEO to build something innovative around on-demand movies and that to build a platform that allows you to do that, like they're not going to be thinking, I'm just going to like build another Netflix,
Right, right,
right? Like they're like, how do I disrupt the way somebody does something in order to create something better,
right, right,
right?
right,
And no one would fund that.
right.
But in education, we tend to say, hey, I saw this school over here or this district doing it over here. Let's be innovative by just doing the exact same thing. And that's not being innovative, right? Like that's just replicating what somebody else did. And so innovation's lost when you just try to replicate what somebody's already done. Innovation is created when you think about things that other people haven't thought about, right? Or you framed it a different way than other people. And so I think like you mentioned, we're challenged with even understanding what innovation is, because the way we talk about innovation is personalized learning is innovation. Having virtual schools is an innovation. It's not that. It's how we think about the problem that's the innovation.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Anthony, the way you can contextualized it perfectly, right? The way we think about the problem is the innovation. And I think, I like to say the cycles of experimentation, right? I remember when I was a superintendent, Anthony, you remember my work? I always used to say, hey, why don't we conduct A/B experiments or A/B tests where we look at the same sample and we obviously put them in controlled treatment groups and then highly monitor and adjust the treatment implementation till we get to a level of scalability, right? Kind of like that design, study, research approach or design, study, investigation approach. However, at that time, you would hear families and parents, oh, I don't want you to innovate on my kid. I don't want you to perform experiments, on my child, but we're really looking at what is the scalable system or the scalable product that we can have for a global impact. But if you can, Anthony, and this is again another subvariant of a question, your answer. You know me, I apologize. Listen, Anthony, I said this to you. I believe we were at the ALAS conference in Puerto Rico. I asked you a while ago, I'm like, you're going to get on my podcast? And you're like, yes. And then we're like geeking out the whole time upstairs on the first floor. So yes, I'm going to ask you all of the subvariants, my brother. But when we talk about, because one of the common misnomers we see in education universally is that replication versus innovation, right? And how could we avoid, because a lot of the times we think of, replicating an innovative practice in another district or another area, we might have the same results that that district might have, but in reality, we don't. It's either slower, implementation get stifled. There's that level of stymie with implementation. But again, if you could just go just a little deeper around replication versus innovation, so that now we have this level set mindset, or this level set around, I want to be able to innovate, but look at some of the replication strategies, but put it to our own context.
Right, exactly. So I'll just kind of use the example of virtual schools, because I think a lot of people have experience with virtual schools now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the way people would look at virtual schools in the early days was some district would have a pretty decent virtual school implementation. Let's say Florida Virtual, right? And they'll just say, oh, let's just replicate that, but make the curriculum a little bit better. And so instead of just figuring out a business transaction with an organization like that, and then building on top of it, they'll instead want to start from scratch and build everything from kind of base level, because what they thought they could see it, and then they'll say, oh, well, that's not quite good enough. And so we're going to make it better. And what they don't realize is that they haven't really thought through the magnitude of something like that.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And also they haven't really thought about like what problem are they really trying to solve that the students need that requires that kind of brand new development.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And most likely on the curricular side, it's probably doesn't require a whole lot of brand new development, right? There's probably some modification, but what probably could have accelerated our experience with virtual learning is to really think about what the asynchronous, synchronous, online, offline experience of a student might be so that it's better than what they were getting, which was just like a kind of a boring online stream in the early days, right?
Right.
And so I think what could have happened is we like kind of built on the technology and skills that people have already experienced and then continue to evolve that as opposed to trying to rebuild it from scratch. And we've always done that with state standards, assessments, you name all of the things that we've tried, like we've always tried to build it from scratch.
Absolutely.
And one of the problems, which I wanted to address later is the structure it's created because of the way education is structured in the United States.
Absolutely. 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 And Anthony, we're going to get into that later, but I really want to highlight on a key theme that you highlighted, and this question needs to be asked with a level of vigor and then also with a level of intentionality when we're looking at the reimagination or the transformation of our organizations, learning organizations, is what problem or what problems are we trying to solve? That is a huge question, right? And developing prototypes and hypotheses around what those problems are, that now needs to become this innate practice or this innate skill among leaders as well as among the cabinet level and including principals, where now we're looking at problems with intentionality and that level of innovation coming in and moving from that a practice, standardized practice of replication, but kind of going into that now with organizational structures and systems, learning organizations, architecture, right? But I want to infuse in this, I like to say new but old, right? Phenomena of education technology and artificial intelligence, because I consider you one of the experts in the country around organizational design work and the broad continuous improvement mechanisms for systems effectiveness, trying to solve the problem of the learning organization. But we're moving into the second year of the AC stage of education. How do we successfully start to examine or unpack organizational design and transformational work underpinning technology and artificial intelligence for innovation and equity?
Yeah. So I think just to kind of step back, and I always like to give other types of analogies to help like us process it. So let's say, let's take electric cars, for example, Tesla, Ford, all these other companies are coming out with electric cars. Tesla actually spent all of their time building out the infrastructure, right? Fewer models of cars, but like built out all of this infrastructure and built it with this innovation that actually allowed you to charge directly to the battery without converting it, right? And so it allowed you to supercharge, right? Because you're charging the battery directly.
Right.
So they build out this infrastructure, and then people thought, well, it's like a monopoly, whatever. And then other companies like Ford decided, oh, they need to build electric cars, but then like charge points came out because they were charging, but charging at a supercharger, it takes a long time. It takes longer than filling up your gas tank. Yep. But charging at a charge point at a slow charger takes even longer. And there's fewer stations around that. And so what now you're seeing is that the large auto manufacturers are going to Tesla and trying to use their infrastructure because it's already kind of built out. And so they focused on the car, not the infrastructure.
Right.
Right. And not the charging experience, because that's the real distractor. And so I think that when we think about education technology and stuff, we focus so much on the technology itself
Correct.
and not the overall learning experience.
Correct.
And so I think that's what we need to focus on. And so part of the reason we're hearing a lot of attention is because a lot of the questions were just like gas stations versus charging stations. We have these assessments and homework assignments that can be overturned by AI, right? Like easily done by AI. And so instead we argue about the AI instead of saying the homework assignments are the problem, right?
Exactly, exactly. And Anthony, I hear that all the time across the country, right? Oh, it's the technology, it's the AI. The AI is not working, or this technology. Everybody's talking about it, but it's not, really working with my students or within the organization. But then I ask, well, what is the pedagogy, and what are the resources that are supporting it? And did you even identify the correct AI solution or software for your students? I think that when you say technology versus the actual learning, we still have to shift that mental model, right? I like to say that mental model where how are we looking at the learning outcomes and closing specific opportunity and equity gaps where the technology is going to be able to drive that as a lever, as opposed to the whole technology piece and just kind of supplanting, as what I see in education now, supplanting technology and say, hey, we're moving towards this AI technology learning organization where it's both. When you're like, okay, did you have an assessment? Did you assess the readiness of your learning organization? But again, please elaborate, Anthony, because this is so foundational to how we're able to make this shift in a positive way for students, for teachers, and leaders included.
Yeah. So just on the AI front, let's say, for example, you and I were given a question around the key principles of learning organizations, and someone produced an AI presentation off of that. And we looked at it. I think you and I have read enough materials where we could look at it and be like, all right, that's pretty basic, right? Like it's still like, pretty rudimentary. And
Yeah,
how do we dig in more? And the person would have to try to dig in. They'll ask AI another question, and we'll still be able to keep on drilling down. And that's where expertise exists, right? If you have expertise, you could identify these things and be able to navigate how accurate it is, or verify it, or it's not contextualized in the right way, and even apply it.
absolutely.
So I think the fear that exists is that the education system isn't really prepared to have all the teachers have this level of expertise in all of these topics, and so the AI actually can produce outputs faster than a human can in some ways. But if you're dealing with an expert, there's probably professors that I could deal with showing an AI report that I wrote. They would look at it and be like, oh, well, you produce that from AI because it's just like what Wikipedia shows, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
it's this, at a very surface level. And so I think this is where, like, as a country, we have to get to a deeper level of learning, and we have to build instruction that pushes us to a deeper level learning, because I think if we don't do that, we'll lose the ability for people to verify
yeah.
and to execute with prior knowledge. We're just going to rely on the AI to tell us what's right.
Absolutely. Anthony, I love what you stated. Deeper levels of learning. To my audience, deeper levels of learning. That is cognitive rigor. That is academic rigor in conjunction with AI to be able to support that. But again, great segue into this next question, because Anthony, you and I know about this report that was generated by McKinsey and Company, really highlighted in my book, highlighted in my framework as well, where the Delta 2030 report, right? And it highlights 4 domains, 56 different competencies to successfully navigate in this new Delta 2030 world, right? And the education model, or the operating model, as of now, only incorporates 2 of those large domains. The next 2 that we need to intentionally integrate into our organizational design is that self-leadership and digital leadership piece of it. But that report, right? If you think about it from the time frame where we're at now, that is 6.5 years away. That's a blink of an eye in the education world, right? And we have to adopt this, I say, strategic level of urgency. But from your level of expertise, Anthony, we know that this is 6.5 years away. To really shift a huge education model that has been operationalizing in this batch industrialization context for years, that's going to be hard to change. But how do leaders and change agents plan and implement organizational change with intentionality, albeit being bold to align education in totality with this new economic demand of Delta 2030?
Yeah. When you posed this question, I had to read through the article again. And, one of the things I noticed is that if we took this article in a different country,
Mm-hmm.
let's pick Singapore or South Korea or any country, uh, they would say, okay, this is a mission and a vision and goal for our society, right? Our country. We have to build this capacity. And so let's change our curriculum and put these opportunities, let's fund it. And then over the next 10 years, like start to see some change.
Right, right.
Now, if you did that same approach in the US, the US DOE would say this, and then we would argue about funding levels, and then we would push it to the states to decide how they want to implement it. And then there would be debates in that across each state. And then the state will get it. And then, the south part of Florida would argue about one thing. The north part of Florida would argue about a different thing. And then they would implement this in their own separate ways differently.
Right.
And so it's kind of like that telephone game. By the time like it gets to the district, local community, it's something completely different than what was intended or understood. And most likely the people implementing Delta, 2030 haven't even read it by the time it got to that level, right? And it was 4 years later that it does that. And so I think we really have to rethink what role and accountability does the U.S. Department of Ed need to have in order for us to lift everybody up in this kind of framing? And then what role does the local community have in discerning some of this? I think the challenge we have right now and the model we have was designed off of a system where Michael Connor grew up in a state and just didn't move for a long period of time. But now, people just move from state to state. So what I'm prepared for in Las Vegas versus California versus Arizona is just different. And so if I move, I'm constantly kind of having to reorient myself in this kind of learning, and we can't operate that way.
Yeah, yeah. And Anthony, you talk about it, and we talk about it, right? This national incongruence of what education looks like, and many people I've spoken to, whether it be individuals at the higher education level, academia, researchers, experts like you, Anthony, and one of the collective trends that I'm hearing in context is how do we create this level of coherence nationally, whether it be from the USDE to our SEAs, to our LEAs, down to the schools, right? State education agencies for my audience, SEAs, LEAs are local education entities, now down to the school improvement process at the school level. And we always see this, whether it be vertical or horizontal disjunction, i.e. from the interpretation of, let's say, the work of a Delta 2030, right? I'm going to use an analogy, Anthony. We want the spaghetti and the good meatballs. We got the recipe. And then now we get, something else besides spaghetti and meatballs. But you are absolutely right. And Anthony, my last question to you, and I usually ask this question in 3 words, right? Because I want my audience to take away 3 pivotal points from each of my guests. So the question is, Anthony, what 3 words do you want today's audience to leave our episode with successfully adopting organizational habits to achieve all for Generation Z and Generation Alpha? what three words will define innovation, equity, and excellence with organizational habits that will create a pathway to successfully matriculate into this new paradigm of what we were just talking about before, Delta 2030?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question because I could segue into some new work that I'm building out right now, and that work is collectively called the art of implementing well.
Oh, wow. You heard it first on VFB.
Yeah,
All right. Can you repeat
yeah.
that one more time, Anthony? And when is that coming out?
It's called the art of implementing well, and we're trying to build out a framework for districts to think about to implement anything.
Yeah.
And I think it's pretty interesting, but the core principles around it are these three words: mindset,
Mhm.
collaboration, and resilience.
Absolutely.
So mindset is just, how do I get people in the mindset of understanding and kind of being open to this change?
Mm-hmm.
Collaboration is, I think, an example would be you and I just spent a lot of time talking about Delta 2030, and we got to collaborate on this topic a little bit. But if you're trying to implement Delta 2030 in your district, you need to give other people time to collaborate around the topic too. And it's not just about collaboration around it for the sake of working, but it's really to have discourse around it so that you can elevate your understanding of it and comfort level around it. Because I think a lot of implementations are hindered by fear.
Absolutely.
And then the third piece is resilience. And these are just the systems that need to exist. I had a conversation with the Department of Ed the other day, and they were like, hey, we're got to train X number, 5,000 teachers a year on science of reading, but we just realized that 2,000 of them leave, to do other things, different grades, different districts, different states. And so how do you build systems that anticipate change? And that's where, game theory comes in, because we just assume that the response is static, but it's not, right? The people on the other side respond differently than the way you anticipate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Anthony, I tell you, you heard it first to my audience on VFB, The Art of Implementing Well by Anthony Kim. And the three words: mindset, collaboration, and resilience. And Anthony, again, I apologize. I want to pick your brain again. This word of listen, I got you on. I am going to have you on as long as I can. I'm learning as well. You see the pin, but good brother, elaborate on collaboration, because that word, it brings a different connotation. And I think that collaboration, specifically when we look at it from the education ecosystem lens, it's just, we collaborate to work, right?
It's diluted. Yes. Yeah, totally.
Unpack that, because
Yeah.
collaboration with discourse to be able to create a shared mental model around the organizational goals, theories, objectives, theory of action, change, however we want to contextualize it. Please just unwrap collaboration, because there are some misinterpretations with regards to what that looks like in practice.
The way I'd like to see it play out in a district is, let's say, we'll just use learning organizations again. So some leader goes to a conference, hears about learning organizations, they read a book, they do all this, they talk to Michael, they talk to Anthony. And in those conversations, there was discourse and collaboration that happened just to understand it and to learn together. Yeah. Right. And it's a mix of people of equal levels of knowledge and people with more experience. And also then you conveying your knowledge to somebody that knows a little bit less. That's kind of the whole big collaboration. So then what happens is that's a great idea. And then we take it to our cabinet and we're like, hey, we're going to become a learning organization. We're like, this is what you need to do. And all of a sudden everybody has to go off and do it. And they never really had an opportunity to learn what that is and make it part of their psyche around the work that they're trying to do. And so what I mean by the collaboration is, how do you recreate the experience that you had as a learner with your team so that they feel like they went through a similar type process to gain all of that knowledge to execute on this? And that's really quite hard to do.
Absolutely. And Anthony, thank you for that. And to my audience, right? A key phrase Anthony highlighted: recreate the experience as a learner, right? And learning together. That goes back to that organizational thread or tenet around capacity with the new systems and structures that you are implementing. And that discourse, please, as you're creating these collaborative networks or these hubs, these collaborative hubs around learning for intentional organizational redesign and change, diverse perspectives, divergent perspectives is needed. We don't need 6 to 10 or 10 to 20 people that has the same mindset, challenging each other frame so you can build a strong prototype. But Anthony, you lasted. You survived VFE, brother. Oh man, it is such an honor to have you on. But for my audience, if they want to get in touch with you or to continue or start a conversation with regards to some of the questions and your responses, how would they be able to reach you?
Yeah, I always try to respond to people that reach out. And, right now, the best platform is just on LinkedIn, just to connect with me, and I'll respond to messages on LinkedIn. And that's a great way to do it. And also then you could see, content that's related and stuff like that. So, and then on YouTube, we have a channel for education elements, and there's ways to reach out through the YouTube channel as well.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, to my audience, yes, that's exactly what I did with Anthony Kim when the personalized learning playbook came out. I reached out to Anthony. I didn't expect that I was going to get a reply back. And sure enough, within that day, did not know me from Adam. Anthony replied back to answer my questions. And then when the new school rules came out, that's when I reached out to Anthony continuously. And then we developed a relationship from there. So Anthony, thank you again. Such an honor to have you on VFB. I will contact you. We got to get together. We got to talk more. Not to this point where we're geeking out like this, but just catching up and seeing how life is.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I mentioned, I'll be in Rochester pretty soon. So
Uh-oh.
there, yeah.
Uh-oh. You know what that means to my audience? The notebook and the pen will be right out.
Maybe we'll live stream for a few minutes.
Exactly, right? We'll go live stream with that. Anthony, can't wait to see you on, in Rochester soon. And on that note, everybody, onward and upward. Have a good day.